The billionaire woman fell in love with handsome driver she hired. His voice had an accent she couldn't quite place, Italian, maybe, or Spanish. Before she could respond, the car lurched forward as protesters suddenly surrounded them, their signs and chanting faces pressed against the tinted windows. Her security team was overwhelmed, shouting into radios, completely useless. Cassandra's breath caught. Not fear, she told herself, just strategic concern, as someone started rocking the vehicle. Andrea's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, calm as a frozen lake. Hold on, Ms. Ashford. What happened next was poetry in motion. He didn't accelerate wildly or honk frantically like her previous drivers would have. Instead, he lowered his window, spoke to the crowd in a voice that somehow carried authority and respect simultaneously, and navigated the Maybach through the massive bodies with such precision that not a single protester was touched, yet they all moved aside like he'd commanded the Red Sea to part. 10 minutes later, they were gliding smoothly along the highway, the protest behind them like a bad dream. Cassandra's hands were shaking. She hated that they were shaking. She pulled out her checkbook, the same way she solved every problem, with money, and began writing. $100,000. Generous enough to buy absolute silence about her moment of weakness. She held it out between the seats. For your discretion about what happened back there. Andrea glanced at the check, then back at the road. He didn't take it. I don't need your money, Ms. Ashford. Everyone needs money. It came out sharper than she intended. Take it. Consider it a bonus for handling a difficult situation. Before we get into the main story, let me know in the comment section where you are watching from, subscribe and share because I have more interesting stories to share with you. Cassandra's life existed behind tinted windows. Literally and metaphorically. The penthouse suite on the 47th floor had floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the city, but they were specially treated. She could see everything, and no one could see in. Her office at Ashford Technologies had the same setup. The Maybach's windows were tinted to the legal limit. Even her sunglasses cost $3,000 and hid her eyes from the world. It was exactly how she liked it. Observation without vulnerability. Power without proximity. The morning routine never varied. Andrea arrived at precisely 6:45, waited in the circular driveway while Nusa, her long-suffering housekeeper, brought Cassandra's coffee and briefcase. By 7, they were pulling out of the estate, beginning the daily journey through a city that loved her money and hated her success in equal measure. For the first 3 days after the protest incident, Cassandra had tried to ignore him, tried to treat Andrea like Marcus, like the dozen drivers before Marcus, invisible, interchangeable, part of the machinery that kept her life running smoothly. But Andrea wasn't like the others. He didn't talk unless spoken to, which should have been perfect. But his silence felt different. Observant. Like he was cataloging everything about her, the way she took calls in 3 languages, how she never ate breakfast but always had that second coffee, the fact that she did her most vicious contract negotiations before 9 a.m. when her opponents were still groggy. You're staring, Cassandra said on day 4, not looking up from her tablet as they sat in morning traffic. Apologizes, Ms. Ashford. Just checking the mirrors. But she'd felt his eyes on her, not the road. It should have annoyed her. Should have prompted a call to the agency demanding a different driver. Instead, she found herself glancing up more often, catching glimpses of his profile in the rearview mirror. He was always watching the world around them with an intensity that went beyond professional caution. When they stopped at lights, his eyes tracked pedestrians, other vehicles, the reflections in storefront windows. When they parked, he scanned the area before opening her door, his body positioned between her and potential threats she'd never even considered. "You're not just a driver," Cassandra observed one morning, the words escaping before she could stop them. Andrea's eyes met hers in the mirror. "Everyone's just something until they're allowed to be more, Ms. Ashford." The comment hung in the air between them, weighted with implications she wasn't ready to unpack. Cassandra returned to her tablet, to the safety of spreadsheets and acquisition targets and things that made sense. But that evening, as they pulled into her estate and Andrea came around to open her door, she found herself hesitating before stepping out. The tinted windows created a bubble, a space where she wasn't the ice queen of Silicon Valley or the billion-dollar bitch the tabloids loved to hate. Just a woman in the back of a car, watched over by a man who refused to treat her like a commodity. "Same time tomorrow?" Andrea asked, his voice professional but his eyes holding something else entirely. "Same time," Cassandra confirmed, and told herself the flutter in her chest was just the espresso from lunch. She was a terrible liar, even to herself. The board meeting had been a massacre. Not the kind where Cassandra emerged victorious. She was used to those, thrived on them even. This was the other kind, where Julian Prescott, her ex-partner and current nemesis, had systematically dismantled her Q4 projections in front of 12 board members who suddenly looked at her like she might be fallible after all. "Your aggressive expansion into the Asian market is reckless," Julian had said, his smile sharp as a blade. "Perhaps Ms. Ashford's personal judgment has begun to cloud her business acumen." The implication was clear. Everyone knew about the whispers, about her handsome new driver, about how she'd been taking longer routes home, about the fact that the Ice Queen might be thawing for someone completely inappropriate. It was 11 p.m. when she finally left the building. Andrea was waiting, as always, but instead of her usual curt nod, Cassandra collapsed into the back seat and pressed her fingers against her temples. "Home, Ms. Ashford? Just drive." Her voice cracked on the second word, and she hated herself for it. "Anywhere. I don't care." Andrea didn't question it, didn't offer platitudes. He simply pulled into traffic and drove. They left the financial district, passed through the upscale neighborhoods where Cassandra's peers lived in their architect-designed prisons, and kept going until the buildings got shorter and the lights got warmer. 20 minutes later, the Maybach pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner that looked like it had been transplanted from 1950s America. Neon lights flickered rosies in pink cursive. Through the windows, Cassandra could see truckers and night shift nurses and regular people living regular lives. "What are we doing here?" she asked. Andrea opened her door, offering his hand. "Having a midnight breakfast. Unless you'd prefer to go home and pretend today didn't happen." She should have fired him on the spot for the familiarity. Should have reminded him of the dozen non-disclosure agreements he'd signed. Instead, she took his hand and let him lead her into the diner. The hostess didn't recognize her. The waitress didn't ask for a selfie. No one stared or whispered or calculated her net worth with greedy eyes. Andrea guided her to a corner booth with cracked vinyl seats and ordered coffee without asking if she wanted any. "I'm not hungry," Cassandra said, but her voice had lost its edge. "Then don't eat. Just sit." Andrea leaned back, looking entirely too comfortable in a place that probably violated a dozen health codes. "You know what your problem is, Ms. Ashford? I'm sure you're about to tell me. You've forgotten what it feels like to just exist. Everything is strategy, acquisition, dominance. But right now, in this diner, you're not a billionaire. You're just a woman having bad coffee at midnight. And that's okay." The waitress returned with 2 chipped mugs and a carafe. The coffee was terrible, watery and bitter, and Cassandra found herself drinking it anyway. Around them, the diner hummed with mundane conversations about overtime shifts and weekend plans and things that had nothing to do with stock prices or hostile takeovers. "Julian wants my company," she said finally, surprised at her own honesty. "He's been building a case that I'm unstable, that I'm making reckless decisions." "Are you?" "I don't know anymore." She wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "I've spent 15 years building walls, and now everyone thinks I'm losing my mind because I hired a driver who doesn't treat me like an ATM machine." Andrea was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes studying her face in a way that should have felt invasive but somehow didn't. "Maybe losing your mind a little isn't the worst thing. Maybe it's just making room for your heart." The emergency board meeting was called for Friday at 2 p.m., which told Cassandra everything she needed to know about Julian's confidence. He wasn't even bothering with subtlety anymore. Friday afternoon meant he wanted this done before the weekend, before she could rally her allies or prepare a proper defense. She walked into the boardroom in Valentino armor, a black suit that cost more than most people's cars and made her look like she could buy and sell everyone in the room. Which technically she could. But money only mattered when people believed in your power to wield it. Julian sat at the far end of the table, surrounded by 3 board members who'd apparently already been bought. He smiled when she entered, the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse before the killing blow. "Cassandra, thank you for joining us on such short notice." "Cut the pleasantries, Julian. What's this about?" He stood, activating the presentation screen with a remote. The first slide showed Ashford Technologies' stock price, down 8% over the last quarter. The second showed competitor gains. The third showed a timeline of her erratic behavior that made her stomach turn. "The board has concerns," Julian began, his voice carrying that false sympathy that made her want to break things. "About leadership stability. About decision-making that seems increasingly emotional. My decisions have grown this company by 300% in 5 years, Cassandra said, her voice ice-cold despite the fury building in her chest. "My emotional leadership has made everyone in this room considerably wealthier. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results." Julian clicked to the next slide, a photograph of her and Andrea at the diner, clearly taken through the window. She looked vulnerable in it, human, her walls stripped away. When the CEO of a Fortune 500 company starts having midnight rendezvous with her driver at cheap diners, it raises questions about judgment. The room went silent. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Cassandra felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the empire she'd built suddenly feeling as fragile as spun glass. "My personal life is none of this board's concern. It is when it affects your professional performance," Julian continued, warming to his theme. "Look at you, Cassandra, the woman who built this company through ruthless efficiency, now making impulsive decisions, taking unnecessary risks, all because you're lonely. Because you have no one to go home to accept paid staff and a driver who's probably counting the days until he can sell his story to the tabloids." "That's enough." Her voice cracked like a whip, but Julian wasn't finished. "I'm proposing a vote of no confidence, not to destroy you, but to save the company you built before your personal crisis destroys it first." He looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member. "All those in favor of removing Cassandra Ashford as CEO and appointing interim leadership while we conduct a proper search." 4 hands went up. Then 5. Cassandra watched her empire crumble, one raised hand at a time, and realized that Julian had been right about one thing. She was completely devastatingly alone. Cassandra sat in the back seat of the Maybach feeling hollowed out, a billion-dollar shell with nothing inside. The vote had been tabled, barely, thanks to Margaret Chen, her CFO, who'd called for a 2-week review period before any final decision. 2 weeks to prove she wasn't having a breakdown. 2 weeks to save everything she'd built. Andrea hadn't asked about the meeting, hadn't offered sympathy or advice. He'd simply opened her door, met her eyes with that steady, unreadable gaze, and driven. They were taking the coastal route back to the estate, the sunset painting the ocean in shades of amber and rose. Cassandra almost didn't notice when Andrea's posture changed. It was subtle, a slight straightening of his shoulders, his eyes flicking more frequently to the rear-view mirror. His hands shifted position on the wheel, grip tightening almost imperceptibly. "What is it?" she asked, years of reading boardroom power plays making her sensitive to shifts in tension. "Black SUV. 3 cars back. It's been with us since we left downtown." Cassandra turned to look, but Andrea's voice stopped her. "Don't. If they know we've noticed, it changes their approach." "You think someone's following us?" Julian wouldn't, but even as she said it, she remembered the photograph at the diner. If he'd been willing to have her surveilled then, why not now? "Hold on, Ms. Ashford." Andrea accelerated smoothly, nothing dramatic, just enough to open distance between them and the SUV. But the vehicle matched their speed, closing the gap. They were on the coastal highway now, cliffs on one side, ocean on the other, minimal traffic. The SUV suddenly surged forward, pulling alongside them. Cassandra caught a glimpse of tinted windows, a driver wearing sunglasses despite the fading light. The vehicle swerved toward them, not quite making contact, but close enough that the message was clear. "They're trying to force us off the road," Cassandra whispered, her earlier numbness replaced by sharp, crystalline fear. Andrea's response was immediate and breathtaking. He accelerated hard, the Maybach's engine roaring to life as he pulled ahead of the SUV. Then, as they approached a hairpin turn, he did something that defied every instinct of self-preservation. He braked hard and turned into the curve at an angle that should have sent them spinning into the guardrail. Instead, the car executed a perfect Scandinavian flick, the rear end swinging out in a controlled drift that positioned them facing back the way they'd come. The SUV, unable to stop in time, shot past them and had to slam on its brakes. Andrea immediately reversed, found a service road Cassandra hadn't even noticed, and took it at speed. 5 minutes later, they were on a parallel road heading back toward the city, the SUV nowhere in sight. Andrea's breathing was steady, his hands relaxed on the wheel like he'd just parallel parked rather than executed a maneuver that belonged in a spy film. "Where did you learn to drive like that?" Cassandra demanded, her heart still hammering. Andrea's eyes found hers in the mirror, and for the first time, she saw something vulnerable there. "I used to do executive protection. Before." "Before what?" "Before I took the fall for someone else's mistake and lost everything." He pulled into a gas station, parking in the shadows away from the pumps. "Ms. Ashford, whoever hired those men isn't playing games. This was a warning. Next time, it might be worse." Cassandra couldn't sleep. At 3 a.m., she found herself in her home office with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking and a laptop open to search results she shouldn't be looking at. But after the highway incident, after watching Andrea handle a potential assassination attempt with the calm of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before, she needed to know. Andrea Santoro. The name had seemed simple, forgettable. Now she typed it into search engines with increasing specificity, adding keywords: executive protection, tactical driving, scandal. The article she found was buried 6 pages deep, dated 4 years ago. Elite protection agent takes fall in ambassador's death. She clicked, and Andrea's face stared back at her from a press photo, younger, cleaner cut, wearing a suit that screamed federal service rather than private sector. According to the report, Andrea had been part of a protection detail for the Italian ambassador to the UN. During a motorcade rout, an IED had killed the ambassador and 2 other agents. The investigation concluded that Andrea, as team leader, had failed to properly secure the route. He'd been dismissed, his reputation destroyed, blacklisted from every major security firm. But as Cassandra read deeper, clicking through archived news reports and blog posts from security analysts, a different story emerged. Questions about why the route had been changed at the last minute. Suggestions that someone in the ambassador's own staff had leaked the information. Whispers that Andrea had objected to the route change but been overruled by his superior, who'd mysteriously retired 6 months later with full pension and honors. You should be asleep. Cassandra spun in her chair. Andrea stood in the doorway of her office, still dressed despite the hour. He must have been doing his own version of not sleeping, probably reviewing security footage or checking perimeter cameras. The door was open, he added, but made no move to enter. I saw the light. She turned the laptop to face him, the article still displayed. You took the fall for someone else. Andrea's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Old pain, older resignation. That's the job sometimes. The person you're protecting isn't always the one in the motorcade. Your superior made the call, changed the route, and when people died, he let you be crucified for it. He had a family, a career. I had neither. Andrea finally stepped into the room, his hands in his pockets. It was logical, clean. 1 career destroyed instead of 2. That's not logic, that's cowardice. Cassandra stood, crossing to him. You were a hero. You saved lives. I found the commendations from your previous assignments. And they threw you away because it was convenient. Why do you care? The question came out rough, almost accusatory. I'm your driver, Ms. Ashford. Hired help. Why does my past matter? Because I understand what it's like to be sacrificed for someone else's ambition. The words escaped before she could stop them. Julian was my partner when I founded this company. We built it together, 50-50. But when investors came calling, when we needed to decide who would be CEO, he convinced me that I should step back, let him be the face of the company because investors were more comfortable with male leadership. She laughed bitterly. I was naive enough to believe him, to think partnership mattered more than power. What changed? I did. I staged a boardroom coup, bought out his shares, and took what was always mine. She met Andrea's eyes. But I learned the lesson. Trust no one, show no weakness, keep everyone at arm's length. Until now, Andrea said softly. Until now, she agreed. The whispers started on Monday morning. Cassandra could feel them following her through the Ashford Technologies building like a physical presence, heads turning away too quickly, conversations stopping mid-sentence when she approached, eyes tracking her movements with a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. By Tuesday, the whispers had names attached. Did you see her driver? One of the junior executives said in the break room, not quite quietly enough. I mean, he's gorgeous, but come on. It's so obvious what's happening. I heard Julian's calling for a full psychiatric evaluation, another voice chimed in. Says she's having some kind of midlife crisis. Dating the help? That's not the Cassandra Ashford who built this company. Cassandra stood on the other side of the frosted glass partition, her hand frozen on the door handle. She should have pushed through, let them see her, watch them scramble with embarrassment. Instead, she turned and walked back to her office, each step feeling like she was dragging chains. Margaret found her 20 minutes later, staring at her computer screen without actually seeing it. "They're eating you alive out there," her CFO said without preamble, closing the door behind her. Julian's planted stories with 3 different gossip blogs. There are photos of Andrea opening your car door, Andrea walking you to your building, Andrea existing within 50 feet of you. They're spinning it like some kind of scandalous affair. It's not an affair. The words came out defensive, and Cassandra hated how they sounded. I know that. You know that. But Julian doesn't care about truth. He cares about optics. And the optics of a billionaire CEO with a handsome driver half her age. He's 37. I'm 42. That's hardly. Cassandra. Margaret sat down across from her, her expression softer than usual. I'm on your side. I voted against the no confidence measure. But you need to understand what you're up against. Julian has convinced half the board that you're compromised, that your judgment is clouded by personal feelings. My personal feelings have nothing to do with how I run this company. Don't they? Margaret leaned forward. You've taken 3 late afternoon drives this week that weren't on your schedule. You canceled the Tokyo conference call because you were unavailable at midnight, the same time someone saw you and Andrea at that diner again. You defended him in a board meeting when Julian suggested replacing your entire security detail with professionals. He is a professional. He saved my life when someone tried to run us off the coastal highway. Which brings us to the other problem. Margaret pulled out her tablet, showing security footage from the building's garage. Julian's people have been documenting everything. Every time Andrea drives you home. Every morning he arrives early and waits. Every lunch break where you sit in the car instead of eating with the executive team like you used to. Cassandra watched the footage with growing horror. Seen through this lens, stripped of context, it did look obsessive. Inappropriate. Like a woman spiraling out of control over an inappropriate attraction. What do I do? The admission of helplessness tasted like ash. You have 2 choices, Margaret said quietly. Fire him and prove Julian wrong. Or keep him and accept that you might lose everything you've built for someone who drives your car. The choice should have been obvious. The company was her life, her legacy, her proof that she mattered. Andrea was just a man, just someone she'd known for a few weeks. So why did the thought of letting him go feel like carving out her own heart? The estate felt different that evening. Noosa had taken the week off to visit her daughter in Portland, and the skeleton staff Cassandra kept on retainer were mostly invisible, maintaining the property's sprawling grounds rather than hovering in the main house. For the first time in memory, Cassandra was truly alone in the mansion that had always felt more like a museum than a home. Andrea pulled into the circular driveway at 7 p.m., exactly on schedule. Cassandra watched from the window as he parked, as he checked his mirrors one final time before stepping out. Any other night, she would have already gone inside, maintaining the careful distance that kept things professional, safe, uncomplicated. Tonight, she met him at the door. Ms. Ashford. His expression shifted to concern. Is everything all right? Come inside. She stepped back, holding the door open. Please. Andrea hesitated, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Professional boundaries versus the pull of something neither of them had been willing to name. Finally, he nodded and followed her into the marble foyer. "I'm supposed to fire you," Cassandra said, leading him through the house toward the west wing. "Margaret says it's the only way to save my company. Julian's convinced half the board that I'm having some kind of breakdown over an inappropriate relationship with my driver." "Then fire me." Andrea's voice was steady, but she heard the tension underneath. "I'll understand. Your company matters more than—" "Then what?" She stopped, turning to face him. "Then you?" "Then the first person in 15 years who's looked at me and seen Cassandra instead of a stock portfolio with legs." They'd reached the ballroom, an absurd addition the previous owner had installed, all crystal chandeliers and parquet floors that Cassandra had never once used. She crossed to the antique bar cart, poured 2 glasses of whiskey that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and handed one to Andrea. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. "I've always known. Every decision, every move, every acquisition, I've always been 3 steps ahead. But with you, I'm just lost." Andrea set down his glass untouched and did something that shattered every remaining wall between them. He held out his hand. "Dance with me." "There's no music." "There doesn't need to be." Cassandra stared at his outstretched hand like it was a live grenade. Taking it meant crossing a line she couldn't uncross. Meant admitting that Margaret was right, that Julian was right, that she was compromised in ways that could cost her everything. She took his hand. Andrea pulled her close, one hand settling at her waist, the other cradling her fingers with surprising gentleness. They moved together in the silent ballroom, swaying to a rhythm only they could hear. Cassandra let her head rest against his chest, felt his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her cheek. "I was supposed to be untouchable," she whispered. "The Ice Queen. No weaknesses, no vulnerabilities. And then you refused my money in that car, and everything started cracking." "Maybe you were always cracked," Andrea said softly. "Maybe you just needed someone who wasn't afraid of the broken pieces." She pulled back enough to look at him, and the expression in his dark eyes made her breath catch. Not worship or greed or calculation, just raw, honest want mixed with something deeper, more dangerous. "If I kiss you," Cassandra said, "I lose my company. Julian wins. Everything I've built collapses." "Then don't kiss me." But Andrea's thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch setting her skin on fire. "Go back to your empire. Fire me tomorrow. Marry some appropriate billionaire and live safely behind your tinted windows." "I don't want safe anymore." "What do you want?" "This," she breathed and closed the distance between them. The Riverside Charity Gala was where power came to see and be seen, where billion-dollar deals were struck over champagne and whispered promises. Cassandra had attended every year for the past decade, always alone, always untouchable in designer armor and cold smiles. This year, Andrea walked beside her. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye in the Riverside Pavilion tracked their progress across the cobblestone courtyard, and Cassandra could practically hear the mental calculations. The billionaire CEO and her devastatingly handsome driver, together at the city's most exclusive event. Julian found them within minutes, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. He'd brought an entourage, 3 board members, 2 journalists, and a woman Cassandra recognized as the district attorney. "Cassandra, how bold of you to bring a date." His eyes raked over Andrea with obvious disdain. Though I suppose date is generous. What's the proper term for paid companionship these days? Andrea's hand tightened imperceptibly on Cassandra's back, but his expression remained perfectly neutral. She'd warned him this would happen, that Julian would try to provoke a reaction, create a scene that could be weaponized in the boardroom. His name is Andrea, Cassandra said coolly. And he's here because I invited him. Is there a problem, Julian? Actually, yes. Julian's smile widened. You see, there's been a rather unfortunate incident. Security just reported that the Castellano diamond necklace has gone missing from the auction display, worth approximately $2 million. Cassandra's blood went cold. She knew where this was going, could see the trap closing like a steel jaw. And the security footage, Julian continued, pulling out his phone with theatrical precision, shows someone matching your companion's description near the display case 20 minutes ago. He turned the phone to show grainy footage of a dark-haired man in a suit. Could have been Andrea, could have been any of 50 men at this event. But that didn't matter. Julian wasn't interested in truth. He was interested in spectacle. That's ridiculous, Cassandra said, but several onlookers were already murmuring, phones emerging to document the drama. Andrea hasn't left my side all evening. Then you won't mind if security searches him? The district attorney stepped forward, her expression professionally sympathetic. Just a formality, Ms. Ashford. To clear up any confusion. This was it, the moment Julian had orchestrated. If Cassandra refused, she looked guilty, complicit. If she allowed it, Andrea would be publicly humiliated, searched like a common criminal while cameras captured every moment. Either way, by tomorrow morning, every news outlet would be running stories about the billionaire CEO whose driver was accused of theft at a charity gala. Andrea started to step forward, to submit to the search with dignity, but Cassandra's hand shot out and caught his arm. No. The single word rang across the courtyard like a gunshot. Cassandra, Julian started, but she cut him off. You want to humiliate him? Fine. But you'll have to humiliate me too, because I'm not letting you search him without probable cause, without a warrant, without anything except your pathetic need to destroy me. She stepped closer to Julian, her voice dropping to something dangerous. And while we're discussing theft, shall we talk about the $3 million you embezzled from the company during our partnership? The offshore accounts I've spent 6 months documenting. Julian's face went white. Around them, phones were recording everything, capturing the moment the Ice Queen finally melted, not with weakness, but with fire. Ms. Ashford, the district attorney interjected carefully, these are serious allegations. They are. And I have documentation. Bank records, email trails, witness statements. Cassandra pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. I'm sending everything to your office right now. Along with evidence that Julian orchestrated tonight's little theater, the necklace is in his car, by the way. His assistant was sloppy with the security override codes. The crowd erupted in chaos. Julian was shouting denials. The DA was on her phone. Journalists were frantically typing on their devices. And through it all, Andrea stood beside Cassandra like an anchor in a storm, his hand finding hers and holding tight. The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of depositions and forensic accountants, of Julian's empire crumbling as systematically as he tried to dismantle hers. The board had issued a formal apology. Margaret had opened a bottle of champagne that cost more than a luxury car. The media had pivoted from scandalous love affair to corporate thriller, painting Cassandra as the brilliant CEO who'd taken down a corrupt partner while everyone focused on her personal life. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she just felt tired. Andrea found her on the estate's riverside path 3 days after the board reinstated her with unanimous support. The same path where she'd walked alone for years, insulated by wealth and walls and the belief that isolation was the price of power. "You've been avoiding me," he said, falling into step beside her. "I've been busy." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Rebuilding trust with the board, restructuring Julian's division, dealing with the media circus. "Cassandra." He stopped walking, caught her hand, and she had no choice but to turn and face him. "What are we doing?" The question hung between them, weighted with everything they'd survived. The protests and the midnight drives, the highway chase and the ballroom dance, the gala showdown that had nearly destroyed them both. Cassandra looked at Andrea's face, at the man who'd refused her money and saved her life and seen her humanity when everyone else saw dollar signs. "I don't know," she admitted. "Every relationship I've ever had was transactional. Partners who wanted my money or my influence or my connections. I learned to see people as assets, relationships as leverage." She stepped closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. "But you're not an asset, Andrea. You're just you." "Is that enough?" His voice was rough with vulnerability. "I'm not a billionaire. Can't offer you private jets or vacation homes or merger opportunities. I'm just a disgraced security agent who drives your car." "You're the man who sees me," Cassandra corrected. "Who treats my fear like it's human instead of weakness. Who dances with me in empty ballrooms and takes me to diners where nobody knows my net worth." She pulled him toward the old stone bridge that arched over the river, the same bridge she'd crossed 1,000 times alone. The sunset painted everything in shades of gold and amber, the water below reflecting light like scattered diamonds. Cassandra had stood on this bridge before, looking at her reflection and seeing only the Ice Queen, the billion-dollar bitch, the woman too powerful to touch. Now she saw something different. Someone different. "I spent 15 years building an empire," she said, turning to face Andrea fully. "Acquiring companies, crushing competitors, proving I was untouchable. And I was miserable. Successful and lonely and convinced that's just what power cost." She took both his hands in hers. "Then you refused my check, and everything started breaking open." "Cassandra, let me finish." She smiled, and it felt strange on her face, genuine, unguarded, the opposite of every carefully constructed expression she'd worn in boardrooms. "I don't want another business partner. I don't want some appropriate billionaire who'll look good in photos and bore me at dinner parties. I want someone who'll drive me to midnight diners when I'm falling apart. Who'll execute defensive maneuvers to save my life. Who'll stand beside me at galas even when it costs him everything." Andrea was staring at her like she'd started speaking another language. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want you. Not as my driver, not as my employee, but as my partner. My equal." She pulled a small box from her pocket, velvet, antique, containing a platinum band she'd had commissioned last week. "I know this is unconventional. I know I should wait for you to propose, follow some traditional script. But I've never been traditional, and I'm not starting now." She opened the box, the ring catching the sunset light. Simple, elegant, engraved with coordinates, the exact latitude and longitude of the diner where he'd first treated her like a person instead of a portfolio. "Andrea Santoro, will you be my co-pilot? Not just in the car, but in life." Will you help me remember that humanity matters more than quarterly earnings, that love is the ultimate luxury, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone see you're afraid? Andrea's laugh came out choked, almost disbelieving. You're proposing to me? On a bridge? At sunset? I'm a billionaire, Andrea. I can afford to be dramatic. But her hands were shaking as she held out the ring. Is that a yes? He answered by pulling her into a kiss that felt like coming home, like breaking free, like every wall she'd ever built crumbling into dust and not caring because he was there to catch her in the rubble. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, he held out his hand. Yes, but only if you let me drive us to the courthouse. Cassandra slipped the ring onto his finger, laughing through tears she didn't bother hiding. Deal. But I'm picking the route. You always do, Ms. Ashford. It's Mrs. Santoro now, she corrected. Or it will be. Eventually. They stood on the bridge as the sun set over the river, the billionaire CEO and her driver, and Cassandra realized that for the first time in 15 years, she wasn't looking at her life from behind tinted windows. She was living it, messy and real and absolutely perfect. Thank you for watching and listening to this story. Hit the subscribe button as I will be bringing more interesting stories. Turn on your notification because you would not want to miss my story for anything.